Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's January 30th, and this week we're going to be talking about some very cool technology that's an absolute game changer for people who can't use their hands. One of the first noticeable MS symptoms that my wife Jean presented with was a tremor. It started out as a tiny tremor in her pinky, but it spread really quickly. So in no time, she was dealing with a major, debilitating tremor in both hands. Now, according to the British Medical Journal, about 50% of the people with MS deal with tremor as one of their symptoms, but only a much smaller percentage end up with what's considered severe tremor. And Jean was one of the unlucky few in this group. She couldn't hold a fork or a pencil. She couldn't type on a keyboard. And considering she was a writer, this effectively ended her career. But aside from no longer being able to do her job, Jean couldn't navigate online. She couldn't send or receive emails. She couldn't control a mouse. She couldn't even use a phone. So finding a way for people who don't have the use of their hands to do these things represents a massive improvement in their quality of life. My guest today is Oded Ben-Dov, a tech entrepreneur from Israel, and he has created exactly that technology. We're going to talk to Oded about what I consider to be a life-changing app in just a few minutes. But first, there are a few other things you should know about. People living with progressive multiple sclerosis have to be feeling pretty encouraged lately. There's been more positive news about work being done to solve progressive MS than I've heard in recent memory. Just this past year, Ocrevus has been approved in the United States and more recently throughout Europe as the first prescription drug approved to treat primary progressive MS. This past December, we had Professor Alan Thompson on the podcast, and Professor Thompson is the chair of the International Progressive MS Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee, and he talked about the multi-million-dollar global research efforts that the Alliance is funding. And now, there's another bit of news underscoring the effort to solve the riddle of progressive MS. Last week, the National MS Society awarded a $1,375,000 research grant to Dr. Howard Weiner at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital to further his work in finding effective treatments for progressive MS. The grant will support the Serial Unified Multi-Center Multiple Sclerosis Investigation Consortium, and that is a bit of a mouthful, which is why they call it Summit. Summit was started in 2012 by Brigham and Women's Hospital and the University of California, San Francisco to collaborate with international MS centers and closely follow thousands of people with multiple sclerosis. And for the next 15 years, the Summit Consortium will track patient information, including MRI scans and blood samples, to examine potential triggers and risk factors for MS progression and to determine the most appropriate treatment options. Most people living with MS can easily explain why fatigue is such a debilitating symptom. It gets in the way of doing everyday activities and has a negative impact on cognitive function. And it's estimated that about 75% of the people living with MS are affected by fatigue. Well, a very small study in Germany suggests that MS-related fatigue might be reduced through non-invasive brain stimulation. Now, in past podcast episodes, we've talked about previous studies that have shown that using a non-invasive brain stimulation technique called transcranial direct current stimulation can reduce fatigue while improving cognitive symptoms in MS patients. But the problem is that many of these studies were based on patients self-reporting. They lacked scientifically objective evaluation of the real impact that brain stimulation was or wasn't having on brain function in MS. So to address this issue, researchers at Otto von Guericke University Magdeburg tested the impact of transcranial direct current stimulation in P300 potential, which is a very complicated way of saying that they found a measurable electrical response from the brain that can objectively assess cognitive function in attention and memory. So now they were no longer relying on subjective patient opinions, but on objective scientific measure and methodology. And using that, they found that the non-invasive brain stimulation had a measurable positive impact on cognitive fatigue, not only during the time that the stimulation was being applied, but afterward as well. So the encouraging results of this small study will hopefully lead to a much larger study and perhaps one day to an effective treatment for MS fatigue. And wouldn't that be life-changing for a lot of people? I want to talk about some sobering but important news from researchers at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine. Using a large database created by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they analyzed multiple sclerosis-related deaths over a 16-year period. And the researchers classified these deaths into 5 racial or ethnic groups: whites, African Americans, Asians, American Indians, or Hispanics of any race. And of the 59,462 patients analyzed, it turns out that 66% were women and 34% were men, which is interesting because that's pretty close to the percentages of women and men who were diagnosed with MS. Now, the death rate among whites was the highest. It accounted for 86% of all the deaths caused by MS during the 16-year period that they studied. White females had the highest MS-related death rate among all of the groups. The analysis also revealed a rapidly rising trend for MS-specific mortality among non-Hispanics in general, and a strong age-specific mortality pattern in African Americans with higher mortality rates among those younger than 55 years of age, and whites who had the highest mortality rate after age 55. Now, in these two groups, mortality increased with age in both sexes, and it peaked between the ages of 55 and 64 for African Americans, and between the ages of 65 and 74 for whites. So the study suggests that MS-specific mortality is affected by race or ethnicity and age, and that whites and females, which are the two groups most affected by MS, are at a higher risk of dying from MS. Statistically, this is what you would expect to find. But the findings of African Americans dying at an earlier age with an increasing mortality trend compared to whites also suggests that MS-related mortality is unequally weighted by race. I know we're going to be seeing future research focus on how and why MS disease progression and MS-related death differ between different ethnic and racial groups. And I know that MS-related death is a very tough topic. It's as hard for me to talk about as it is for some of you to hear, but I really believe that there's something important to explore here. The fact that a disease affects one ethnic or racial group differently than another probably isn't going to be based on biology, but on cultural differences in how different ethnic or racial groups deal with chronic illness. And that fascinates me because cultural behaviors are something that can be changed and those changes can end up actually extending people's lives. So I think this is pretty important news to pay attention to. I guess I should also add as a postscript that those kinds of cultural changes, they happen over time, but they don't come quickly, and they certainly don't come easily. Australian researchers are about to begin a large-scale test of a drug designed to stop progression in multiple sclerosis. Researchers at Monash University believe that they have identified a molecule that will not only protect nerve fibers in the brain, spinal cord, and optic nerves, but could even aid in myelin repair. Now, a drug that protects the central nervous system and supports myelin repair sounds like the holy grail, and researchers are hopeful that the drug being tested will help patients with secondary progressive MS. This study will test for drug toxicity and side effects. MS Research Australia has contributed $70,000 toward the study, and the research team has already patented this new molecule and are in negotiations now with pharmaceutical companies to further develop and test the new drug in clinical trials. New York-based Axim Biotechnologies has received approval from Dutch regulatory authorities to begin clinical trials for MedChew-Rx, a chewing gum that offers a controlled release of cannabinoids to treat MS pain and spasticity. Approved cannabinoid medicines are based on THC and CBD extracted from marijuana or made in the lab. Now, the United States has already approved 3 synthetic cannabinoid medicines, but none have been approved for treating multiple sclerosis. The European Union has approved 5 cannabinoid medicines, and one of them, GW Pharmaceuticals' Sativex, is approved to treat MS spasticity. And Sativex contains the same THC and CBD as Axim Technologies' MedChew-Rx, but Sativex is administered as a mouth spray, and MedChew-Rx is a chewing gum. The approved clinical trial will compare each of these 2 medicines. We talk a lot on the podcast about new MS drug therapies and other emerging treatments from the world of biotechnology, but sometimes huge breakthroughs can come from unexpected places. In a moment, we'll meet Oded Ben-Dov, an Israeli game developer who ended up creating life-changing technology designed to help people living with MS, ALS, and other disabilities. My guest today is Oded Ben-Dov, an Israeli tech entrepreneur who went from being a game developer to creating a smartphone app called Open Sesame and launching a company called Sesame Enable. Now, the Open Sesame app allows anyone who may not have the use of their hands to control an Android smartphone or tablet with head movements. And this doesn't limit you to controlling just a few special apps. This will let you control any app that you can download from the Google Play Store. So welcome to the podcast, Oded.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, sure. So first question, how did a game developer end up creating an app designed to assist people with disabilities in accessing their smartphones?
Right. So it's sort of a serendipitous story. Like you said, I was developing games, and I got on TV to demonstrate a game that was controlled using head gestures. You chase a character around by moving your head. And the very next day, I get a phone call, and the guy says, "Hello, I can't move my hands or legs. Could you make me a smartphone I could use?" Now, that was 5 years ago, and that person on the phone was Giora Livne, today my co-founder in Sesame Enable. And we set out to do just that, create a smartphone that people that cannot move their hands, people who are paralyzed, can use by themselves.
Wow. And how long did that development process actually take you?
So we started 5 years ago. We had a proof of concept quite quickly. We saw that it can be done. And then we started perfecting the solution and meeting more and more beta users to make sure we answer to the widest enough possible audience. So we started meeting people not only with spinal cord injuries, like my co-founder, but people with MS, people with ALS, with cerebral palsy, and we added, as we went along, more and more customization to the solution to make sure it answers the individual's needs.
So initially, did you actually create a dedicated smartphone that would work this way, and then the independent app came later, or was it kind of parallel development? How did that all come about?
So that's a great question, and I'd like to clear any confusion if somebody reads old news. We were initially selling pre-installed phones. What we do, we offer full control, like you said, full control over the device. So it's any apps you want to control. We sort of take over the user interface of the device. Now, this couldn't be done in the past, but believing in our value, we sort of hacked in the possibility. Eventually, Google saw the value we're bringing to our users, and they made it possible in Android 7 for us to become an app, thus letting us switching over from the pre-installed devices model to an app that anyone can download all over the world and just start using hands-free.
Wow, that certainly opened up the opportunity to take advantage of this kind of app to so many more people. That's really, that's terrific.
Yeah, and a shout out to Google. They really validated the solution and the technology.
Well, there's this rumor floating around Silicon Valley that those guys actually know what they're doing. So hopefully this was another good example of that.
Right.
So you mentioned that you've had the opportunity already. I was going to ask you if you distributed the app to anyone living with multiple sclerosis, and it sounds like you have. I'm wondering if what kind of feedback you're receiving on the app.
Feedback is tremendous. People actually use the phrase life-changing in their own words. And it's great every time a new user comes in and tells us he's been on the entire weekend with his friends for the first time on Facebook, or we have a user with MS, Gary from Seattle. He, as the disease progressed, he found himself alone at home while his wife went out to work, leaving him 8 hours a day in front of the same TV channel. When they learned of Sesame, they immediately got it, and suddenly he was in control of the content he was watching, because you can watch YouTube, but you can also connect a smart TV to the smartphone and control that. But more than that, he was on Facebook. He started taking selfies. He's connecting with his family. He has grandchildren now. So it really does open up a world of possibilities, or a connection to the outside world. Because, today everyone's on their smartphones. I mean, that's the place to be, I guess.
I think so. I've often walked into a room and everybody's head is bowed down, staring at their hands, and we all know what they're doing at that point. So I think you're quite right.
Exactly.
And I was thinking about your app, and when I initially thought of it, I thought, well, this is really great because it allows somebody to be able to access the online world, the virtual world, from anywhere. They don't have to be in front of a bunch of specialized and costly equipment to do that. They can actually be outside. They can be anywhere at all. And I thought how liberating that was. But then I made the same connection that it sounds like your user Gary did. And I realized not only can they use this anywhere, but they can be anywhere. This knocks down all the walls for so many people who have those kinds of limitations where, yeah, sure, now they can be on YouTube, they can be on Facebook, they can be on Instagram, they can be on all of the apps that the rest of the world is spending time on, and they don't have to feel like they're missing out.
Right. We've had children play Angry Birds for the first time in their lives. I was thrilled when one of the kids downloaded an app that I didn't know. It was called Stalkerhead, but apparently it's a game his entire class plays, and now he got the chance to participate in that. I mean, when I was a kid, we'd play out in the street with a stick and a ball, but today you go on Stalkerhead. So now he could participate in that.
That's just remarkable and so good for so many people. And if people want to download Open Sesame, they just have to go to the Google Play Store like any other app, and that's where they're going to find it, right?
Correct. It is available for Android 7 devices. If you remember the story, that's when Google made it happen. So the newer Android, you search Open Sesame on the store. You're welcome to visit our website at sesameenable.com. And I should mention that we already have a solution subsidized in 10 states across the United States. And we're working actively on increasing those. So if someone's interested, check with us before. It could be that the state is offering subsidies.
Wow, that's good to know. So what's next for Open Sesame and what's next for Sesame Enable?
We're constantly always taking in feedback from users, always making the solution better and adding capabilities. One of my favorites recently was adding a selfie feature. Because our solution uses the front-facing camera, using the camera by yourself was an issue. And a lot of users asked for a selfie. In the beginning, I didn't really understand why. It was like, this is life-changing technology. Leave me alone with the selfies. That's just a phase. But then I realized everyone's using selfies. So that's why our users need it. They're being a part in what everyone's experiencing. And we got out the selfie feature, and we're seeing users use it, and it's just remarkable to see.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think that selfies are a lot of fun, and of course, at first blush, we can kind of write them off and say, well, there's just something that you can do if you're somewhere and you're alone and you have your phone. Why not? But the fact is, in today's world where maybe we spend a little less time face to face with people, that selfie is a way for everybody to say, I'm here. And certainly, right. Certainly people in the disabled community very often don't get to say that. And the fact that this app lets them say, I'm here too, I just think is a tremendous equalizer and perhaps one of the most important things that really drew me personally to wanting to know more about what the app was all about.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better.
Well, it started out as an interview, but I think you're talking to an obvious fan. I think this kind of technology is, technology is so important. We don't necessarily see enough of the tech entrepreneurial world focused on the disabled community. So it's terrific to talk to somebody who was doing something else and immediately saw the importance of opening up the rest of the world for people who otherwise don't get a chance to sample all of it. So I thank you for the work you're continuing to do. I think it's important. I think it makes a difference in so many people's lives, but I'm sure you get to see that or hear about it firsthand every day.
Right. Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, I have the privilege to wake up and go to work with a purpose, go to work happy. And every time there's a user success story, to be honest, we cry a little because it is very emotional, and we are changing people's lives.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share some of that with us today. We're going to follow where Sesame Enable is going to next. And so I hope we have an opportunity to talk about the next thing that you might be working on down the road.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
That's going to wrap up this week's episode of the podcast. And if you like what you're hearing and you never want to miss one episode, all you need to do is subscribe. And you can do that at Apple iTunes, Apple Podcasts, the Google Music Play Store, Stitcher, or Spotify. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.